Chapter 1 of Headlong Hall by Thomas Love Peacock. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Chapter 1. The Mail. The ambiguous light of a December morning, peeping through the windows of the Holyhead Mail, dispelled the soft visions of the four insides who had slept, or seemed to sleep, through the first 70 miles of the road, with as much comfort as may be supposed consistent with the jolting of the vehicle, and an occasional admonition to "remember the coachman," thundered through the open door, accompanied by the gentle breath of Boreas into the ears of the drowsy traveller. A lively remark that the day was none of the finest having elicited a repartee of quite the contrary, the various knotty points of meteorology, which usually form the exordium of an English conversation, were successively discussed and exhausted, and the ice being thus broken, the colloquy rambled to other topics, in the course of which it appeared, to the surprise of every one, that all four, though perfect strangers to each other, were actually bound to the same point, namely Headlong Hall, the seat of the ancient and honourable family of the Headlongs, of the Vale of Llanberis in Carnarvonshire. This name may appear, at first sight, not to be truly Cambrian, like those of the Rices, and Prices, and Morgans, and Owens, and Williamses, and Evanses, and Parrys, and Joneses, but nevertheless the Headlongs claim to be not less genuine derivatives from the antique branch of Cadwallader than any of the last named multi-ramified families. They claim, indeed, by one account, superior antiquity to all of them, or even to Cadwallader himself, a tradition having been handed down in Headlong Hall for some few thousand years, that the founder of the family was preserved in the deluge on the summit of Snowdon, and took the name of Raianda, which signifies a waterfall, in consequence of his having accompanied the water in its descent or diminution, till he found himself comfortably seated on the rocks of Llanberis. But in later days, when commercial bagmen began to scour the country, the ambiguity of the sound induced his descendants to drop the suspicious denomination of riders, and to translate the word into English, when, not being well pleased with the sound of the thing, they substituted that of the quality, and accordingly adopted the name Headlong, the appropriate epithet of waterfall. I cannot tell how the truth may be, I say the tale as 'twas said to me. The present representative of this ancient and dignified house, Harry Headlong, Esquire, was, like all other Welsh squires, fond of shooting, hunting, racing, drinking, and other such innocent amusements, maisons de hallucinants, as Menander expresses it. But unlike other Welsh squires, he had actually suffered certain phenomena, called books, to find their way into his house, and by dint of lounging over them after dinner, on those occasions when he was compelled to take his bottle alone, he became seized with a violent passion to be thought a philosopher and a man of taste, and accordingly set off on an expedition to Oxford, to inquire for other varieties of the same genera, namely men of taste and philosophers, but being assured by a learned professor that there were no such things in the university, he proceeded to London, where, after beating up in several booksellers' shops, theatres, exhibition rooms, and other resorts of literature and taste, he formed as extensive an acquaintance with philosophers and dilettanti as his utmost ambition could desire, and it now became his chief wish to have them all together in Headlong Hall, arguing over his old port and Burgundy the various knotty problems which had puzzled his pericranium. He had therefore sent them invitations in due form to pass their Christmas at Headlong Hall, which invitations the extensive fame of his kitchen fire had induced the greater part of them to accept, and 4 of the chosen guests had, from different parts of the metropolis, ensconced themselves in the 4 corners of the Holyhead Mail. The 4 persons were Mr. Foster, the perfectibilian; Mr. Escott, the deteriorationist; Mr. Jenkinson, the status quoite; and the Reverend Dr. Gaster, who, though of course neither a philosopher nor a man of taste, had so won on the squire's fancy by a learned dissertation on the art of stuffing a turkey, that he concluded no Christmas party would be complete without him. The conversation among these illuminati soon became animated, and Mr. Foster, who we must observe was a thin gentleman, about 30 years of age, with an aquiline nose, black eyes, white teeth, and black hair, took occasion to panegyrise the vehicle in which they were then travelling, and observed what remarkable improvements had been made in the means of facilitating intercourse between the distant parts of the kingdom. He held forth with great energy on the subject of roads and railways, canals and tunnels, manufactures and machinery.
In short,
said he,
everything we look on attests the progress of mankind in all the arts of life, and demonstrates their gradual advancement towards a state of unlimited perfection.
Mr. Escott, who was somewhat younger than Mr. Foster, but rather more pale and saturnine in his aspect, here took up the thread of the discourse, observing that the proposition just advanced seemed to him perfectly contrary to the true state of the case.
For,
said he,
these improvements, as you call them, appear to me only so many links in the great chain of corruption, which will soon fetter the whole human race in irreparable slavery and incurable wretchedness. Your improvements proceed in a simple ratio, while the factious wants and unnatural appetites they engender proceed in a compound one, and thus one generation acquires 50 wants, and 50 means of supplying them are invented, which each in its turn engenders 2 new ones, so that the next generation has 100, the next 200, the next 400, till every human being becomes such a helpless compound of perverted inclinations that he is altogether at the mercy of external circumstances, loses all independence and singleness of character, and degenerates so rapidly from the primitive dignity of his sylvan origin, that it is scarcely possible to indulge in any other expectation than that the whole species must at length be exterminated by its own infinite imbecility and vileness.
Your opinions,
said Mr. Jenkinson, a round-faced little gentleman of about 45,
seem to differ toto coelho. I have often debated the matter in my own mind, pro and con, and have at length arrived at this conclusion, that there is not in the human race a tendency either to moral perfectibility or deterioration, but that the quantities of each are so exactly balanced by their reciprocal results, that the species, with respect to the sum of good and evil, knowledge and ignorance, happiness and misery, remains exactly and perpetually in statu quo.
Surely you cannot maintain such a proposition in the face of evidence so luminous,
said Mr. Foster.
Look at the progress of all the arts and sciences. See chemistry, botany, astronomy.
Surely,
said Mr. Escott,
experience deposes against you. Look at the rapid growth of corruption, luxury, selfishness.
Really, gentlemen,
said the Reverend Dr. Gaster, after clearing the husk in his throat with 2 or 3 hems,
this is a very sceptical, and I must say, atheistical conversation, and I should have thought, out of respect to my cloth.
Here the coach stopped, and the coachman, opening the door, vociferated, "Breakfast, gentlemen," a sound which so gladdened the ears of the divine, that the alacrity with which he sprang from the vehicle superinduced a distortion of his ankle, and he was obliged to limp into the inn between Mr. Escott and Mr. Jenkinson, the former observing that he ought to look for nothing but evil, and therefore should not be surprised at this little accident, the latter remarking that the comfort of a good breakfast and the pain of a sprained ankle pretty exactly balanced each other. End of Chapter 1.